I'm Nicola Whitton, and I'm a research fellow at Manchester Metropolitan University, and I specialise in research in games and learning. Basically, I figured that becoming a researcher was pretty much as close as I could get to being a student, and becoming a researcher in games was pretty much as close as I could get to being a student who doesn't actually attend any lectures and mucks around all the time and still have a real job. So what I'm going to talk about today, trying to get into 20 minutes, is pretty much to give you an overview of games and learning in higher education today. I'm going to start off with basically giving you the predictions that I'm talking about on the first slide. So what are the three main trends that I think we're going to see in games and learning over the next few years? Then I'm going to give you a bit of theory, Venn diagrams, which I love, and then some examples that exemplify how this theory has been applied in different contexts. And finally, I'm going to finish off with a few takeaways. If you do one thing to start using games and learning in your own classroom, here's some examples of things that you can do. I also want to highlight that Katie Peart, rather than myself, has been in charge of running the Play FOTE game. And this is designed to exemplify some of the points that I'm going to make in this talk. So I really would encourage you, even if you're not convinced by games, even if it's all kind of going on in the background, have a go, engage with it. There's still everything to play for. Anybody can still win. So where to start? What do I think the future of games in higher education is? For me, the typical model that we've had in games, particularly when you're talking about serious games and simulations, has been this model of a game company that produces a high-end, high-fidelity, high-production valued game, possibly costing hundreds and thousands of millions of pounds, which is then given to students and teachers to use. We don't have any money in HE. We can't afford to have this model of spending a lot of money on producing games, which have a lot of issues around motivation and around acceptability. What I think we're going to see more of is enthusiasts and lecturers producing their own games. There are now more and more cheap and easy to use or free game production systems, things like Game Maker, things like Inforum, which allows people to create typical original textual adventures, things like Sandbox Game Maker, which allows to create 3D Venture Game Studio. This idea of people being able to create their own games, to modify their own games, putting the impetus for the design of games away from design companies into the hands of lecturers, I think is really important. The growth in casual games shows that actually games don't need to be on a high-end machine. They don't need to be immersive. They don't need to have these massively high production values. Actually, games that allow people to dip in, play for a few minutes, come out, are just as engaging and are actually engaging and accessible to a far wider range of people. And I think the casual game model is one that we really should look at in higher education. Also, I think we're going to see a resurgence of traditional and mixed media games. Game-based learning has been around for the last 50 years. There have been academics studying it. But the hype around it has really only come with the use of computer games. There's a lot that we can look at and learn from the easy-to-produce traditional games, use of mixed media games, again with low-tech technology involved, websites, using existing technologies and things like alternate reality games. And I think what's exciting about that is really about that it puts the agency into those that are, for designing the games, into those that are actually using the games. The second point, which I'm surprised not to have heard mentioned today, is gamification. And gamification is the idea of, rather than teaching with games, that you take what's good and engaging about games and you apply them to a non-game situation. And this is typically used in marketing, although it is starting to become used more in education. But the model of this has typically been points, badges, leaderboards. You give people badges for achieving something, you have points so they can see how well they're doing, and you have a leaderboard so it's all competitive. And this is part of gamification. I think it's reasonable, it's fine, but it's only going so far. For me, what's really exciting about gamification is things like studying reward systems, looking at how you can get goals that are both achievable and yet motivating. Looking at how challenges can be made of appropriate difficulty levels, looking at how curiosity can be stimulated in games, looking at how we can use things like the human need to make sense of sets and collect in order to make games. So I think we're going to see a massive push around the hype of gamification. Everyone's going to get sick of it, and then we're going to start to see more sophisticated models. Finally, I think there's going to be this blurring between player and creator. And there are already really good examples of this, of teaching programming through game creation, of teaching collaborative skills and transferable skills through game creation, but also the examples from, again, alternate reality games, where communities build up around the game and they shape the game through the narratives that are built around the game, through the mythology that is built around the game. Examples from World of Warcraft, for example, where the more experienced players take on the role of mentors, so it's not for them about playing the game, it's about mentoring new players and creating a wider experience. So I think this blurring is another exciting area that we're going to see. So a little bit of theory. I wasn't quite sure about whether I'd be talking to an audience of people who were pro-games, anti-games, or even people that knew an awful lot about them. So where I wanted to come from was just say, for me, what are the three things and the three reasons that I think games are really exciting for learning in higher education. And I'm going to start with action, because I don't think this bit isn't really about games per se, but games, and a lot of games, I am making the error of talking about games as a holistic thing, when actually there are so many different types of games. So I apologise, but I'm not going to go into too much detail about genre and differences here. But a great many games embody a great many constructivist and active learning principles. Problem solving, collaborative learning, experiential learning, the use of scaffolding, the idea that you start with sort of virtual training wheels and that you learn very quickly. In games, you don't need a manual to learn how to use it. You go in and you start, and you're supported through the learning levels. So for me, these things are not unique to games, but they, in a way, in higher education, where we still have a system where most universities teach most of their students by an expert standing on a stage talking at them, for me, this is an interesting way to get more active and constructivist pedagogies into the classroom through games. But I'm not going to dwell on that here, because I think that's really about where games and good pedagogy overlap. Engagement, and again, this is, I think, the idea about gamification. So it's what aspects of games can you look at that you can employ and use to increase engagement? So it is things like what types of rewards you might give people, what types of goals students have, what types, ways that you might build in curiosity, ways that you might build in set collection. And again, as I said, I think gamification is going to boom, and then we're going to get something a little bit more interesting and sophisticated. But for me, the big area in games and learning, and I think it's one that really gets missed from a lot of the rhetoric around games, is the idea of play. And somebody tweeted earlier about, well, where's the fun? And I think this is where the fun is. But it's not just about fun. It's about the idea of what's called in sort of the gaming literature a magic circle. So that when you step into this magic circle, you're in a safe space. And you're in a safe, and what for me is interesting about safe spaces is there a space in which you can try new things, where the normal rules don't apply, and you can make mistakes. And mistake making and reflection on those mistakes is so important for learning. And that's, for me, what games do, is they provide this space for practice, for mistake making, for fun, for safety. And what I wanted to do, as well, once I've sort of talked through these areas, is give you examples of where I think are really good examples of games used in higher education that exemplify these principles. So this is a slide from a game called Marketplace. And I was involved in evaluating its use in Napier University in, I think, about 2005, 2006. And this was used in a third-year marketing course called Principles of Applied Marketing. And what had been, and it was a follow-on course from a second-year course, which was Theory of Marketing. So students would learn the theory through a series of lectures, then they would go on to learn the application through a series of lectures. And what the lecturer in question did was get rid of all the lectures and replace each 2-hour lecture with part of the game process. And what Marketplace does is it allows you, it basically acts as a game simulation of a company. So that rather than having a lecture on the application, you would actually be pushed straight in and said, well, this is your company situation, and these are the decisions you've got to make. At the end of each decision period, every student working together in company teams would input their decisions, and they'd get immediate feedback on the results of their decisions compared with the other students in the class. And this happened on a week-by-week basis. So it gave them time for reflecting, it gave them immediate feedback, they were working collaboratively, there were problems that they had to deal with in each session, and more importantly, it gave them a real experience of being able to apply what they were learning to real life. The assessment for this wasn't actually linked to the outcome in the game, but it added this extra level of being able to link it to active experience. So at about 4 weeks in, they had to give a presentation to a board of directors about why they'd made the decisions that they'd made. And at the end, they had to do a report about what would be the strategy ongoing. And again, the feedback from the students was that this was far, far more engaging, and they could see much more relevance to real life than simply having another series of lectures about the application. So I think that's a really good example of simply how games can be used to increase the active learning in the classroom. The second one is, I think, a really good example of engagement. And this is a game called The Great History Conundrum, which Alex Mosley implemented at the University of Leicester 2 years ago. And this was aimed at first-year history students who had a lot of issues around evaluation of information and critical analysis of information and working out what was good and what wasn't. And again, this was something that was typically taught in lectures without any relevance to what they were actually doing at any point. And what Alex did is he implemented this game, which he'd called a puzzle card game. So every student in the course was sent 2 or 3 puzzle cards, which all had different difficulty levels. And they could either answer the puzzles, which were all based around information finding, critical analysis, the types of learning outcomes of the course, or they could swap them with other students, or they could go to a discussion board and they could ask for help. And students got points for getting them right, and as soon as they got one right, the leaderboard was updated so they could see where they were in real time. But they also got points for the kind of critical discussions that they were having in the discussion board. And these points actually were part of what inputted into their final assessment score. And again, the amount of engagement with this compared to how it had been taught previously was much, much higher. And I like this game because it's an example of the points and the badges and the leaderboards that actually starts to think about, well, how can we get the critical engagement through a discussion board? And the discussion boards were marked by PhD students, so there was a subjective side to it as well. It wasn't just being based upon the scores that people got in the game. Finally, and I love this slide, because it's students being happy and smiling, and I think, to me, this is really what games can do. This is what games and play is all about. And this is a game that was developed at Manchester Metropolitan University by Claire Hampshire, and I was involved a little bit with helping her with the game design, and it's a game called Staying the Course. And this is designed to help, it's a board game rather than being a digital game, and it's designed to help students go through the transition of coming to university and suddenly finding themselves in a completely different world and not knowing what to ask and not knowing what things are, not knowing what services are available, and really not knowing what's expected of them. But also being in a new environment where they don't know anyone and they don't really necessarily feel confident discussing these types of issues with people. And why this game is fantastic is that the students have fun. It brings down the barriers. I think it's a fantastic example of being able to enter this idea of the magic circle where you have different rules and it's okay to say, actually, I'm lost, I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know how to handle my finances, I don't know what to do if I think I'm on the wrong course. And I think that's a fantastic example of this idea of play. So, just some ideas to take away. And the idea behind this is if you do nothing else, some things to think about, quick and easy ways in which to implement game-based learning or games in teaching and learning. First thing is think about rules and game structure. So this idea of breaking big goals into smaller goals, making those goals difficult enough but yet still achievable. The types of reward systems that are used, the types of ways in which you might collect things, the types of ways in which students can see and visualize progression. Secondly, implement some mystery. Do something unexpected. This is incredibly powerful. Just the idea of stimulating students' curiosity and that actually, maybe it won't be a lecture today. A really good example of this was a student I interviewed last year who was an art student who said his best and most fun experience of teaching and learning was when he went into a 2-hour lecture and the lecturer said, right, you're not doing a lecture today, you're going to do a spot project. Here's your brief, go off and do it for 2 hours and then come back and present. And he said it was hard, but it was challenging, but actually it was really different and it was exciting and it wasn't what they expected. Finally, if you do one thing, think about being playful. Think about ways in which you can create this safe, playful space for students to make mistakes. A good example of this, which I love, is from Salford University, where, and it may be apocryphal, but apparently there's a lecturer there who, rather than picking on a student from the audience, will take a cuddly toy and throw it into the audience and play music, and the students have to throw it around. And when the music stops, the student that the cuddly toy is stuck with gets to answer the question. And for me, it just seems that putting that element of fun and play and light relief is just a really nice example of the types of things that you can do. So, to finish, thank you very much for listening. This is me and various ways of contacting me. I'm very interested in talking to anybody about the use of games learning higher education. I also want to highlight the Games and Learning Special Interest Group for the Association of Learning Technology, which the bottom URL links to. Very interested in anybody who would like to join, and again, continue the conversation. That me?
You've rushed through that one. Thank you very much.